My personal welcome to this session on feeding the world in 2050. Ensuring global food security is critical at any time, but especially so amidst climate change and biodiversity crisis. The three elements are crucially connected: food, climate, and biodiversity, of course. By 2050, the world's population is estimated to reach 9.1 billion, 34% higher than it is today. In order to feed this larger, more urban and richer population, food production must increase by 70%. Although ultimately food security will come from a holistic approach, looking at all sources of food, managed sustainably, and that of course includes aquatic food, our focus today will be on the complex relationship between agriculture and new technologies, focusing on how innovations can create sustainable and resilient systems. And I emphasize that innovation, of course, is needed in many different sectors from many different perspectives. My name is Magdalena Skipper. I am editor-in-chief of Nature, a multidisciplinary international journal of research. And I have a really impressive panel with me here today to discuss this topic. On my right, I have Jack Bobo, who is the director of University of Nottingham Food Systems Institute. He previously served as the senior advisor for global food policy for the US Department of State. He's the author of a book, Why Smart People Made Bad Food Choices. Next to him, I have Dr. Patricia Gruber, who serves as the Science and Technology Advisor to the Secretary of State. In this role, she engages with academia and private sector to inform foreign policy priorities and promote international science and technology collaboration. Moving around the table, I have Dr. Akua Konadu Antwi-Agyakwa, who holds a PhD in entomology from University of Pretoria and currently serves as a research scientist at the Cocoa Research Institute of Ghana. And her special focus is on insect pests of cocoa and cashew. Incidentally, her work inspired Rachel Carson to write The Silent Spring, a book which highlighted the harmful effects of synthetic insecticides on non-target organisms. Moving further around the table, I have, and of course my panelists are not sitting in the order that I was expecting, I have Karin. Karin Guendel Gonzales, who began her career at Bayer in 1996, and following a long and illustrious career with Bayer around the world since 2013, she's been the managing director of Bayer CropScience Deutschland. And last but most definitely not least, on my left is Christophe Marie. He is founder and managing partner of Atlantic Labs and Food Labs in Berlin, investing in early stage tech and food companies. With Atlantic Labs, he has backed lenders such as SoundCloud, Get Your Guide, and Clue in Health, and Food Labs supports startups advancing health and sustainability. So we will be discussing, as I said, the different strategies that are necessary to transform agriculture in particular. We're focusing on agriculture in this conversation. And all the while, we looking to 2050 and ideally beyond for that sustainable food supply. So I'm going to kick off with a question to each one of you, and I would ask you to give me a succinct answer, but just to get your own perspective on a very general question, and that is, what are the primary challenges, from your perspective, to achieving the global food security by 2050? And of course, please keep that context of climate change and resource scarcity in mind. Christophe, I'm going to start with you.
Yeah, so we strongly believe that we need radical innovation We will not be able to get food security by just expanding the food system as it stands. So radical innovation can be, for instance, what we call fermentation farming. So building factories, that can feed whole cities. It is also regenerative agriculture, changing the way we approach agriculture, and that will require true radical innovation. It will require sometimes change in regulation, and that's what we fight for. And we have backed about 40 university spin-off. We believe that Europe has a big role to play, particularly in that space. There are 3 times more engineers in that particular field coming out of university in Europe than there is in the US. And it's just a matter of us being bold enough to back these founders and companies.
Terrific. So I like the way you emphasize innovation in many different ways, not just technology, but also regulation, and real hope there for Europe in terms of the experts that are being trained. Karin, what about you?
So yeah, you've named one challenge, which is the 9.1. We in Bayer say between 9 and 10 billion people in 2050. So we will all need to be fed. So food security is of essence, and for that we believe yield is super important. So we should not lose an eye on the yield in agriculture. That will be the necessity and the foundation for us to be fed. On the other hand, climate change, agriculture is part of the solution for managing CO2 emissions, and we all need to be responsible with the amount of land that we use to actually to produce the food that we will need by 2050. And that in itself are 2 big challenges, and we need our challenges to combine them and to achieve both and not one or the other. This is what I think is the biggest challenge. And the other challenge I'll just add quickly is the walls in ideologies that are around, which are, organic, conventional, GMO, no GMO, gene editing, no gene editing. So I can go on and on.
I will come back to the walls. Hold that thought. How can we not talk about the walls, and especially breaking them down at this event? Absolutely. So you've just added to the conversation an important point about land use. And by the way, the 9.1 estimate just came from the FAO. Okay. So clearly that's a bracket.
That's a good reference.
10. That's right. Yes. Yeah. Akua, from your perspective.
Yes, I would like to say that food security is everybody's business. It's not a business of an institution, an individual, or an organization. It's everybody's business. We all need to get involved to get our food secured. We have roles to play. And to add to Karin's point on climate change impact on agriculture, it's estimated that about 1/3 of the global the greenhouse emission is produced from agriculture. And so we cannot do agriculture the same way we used to do, because climate impact, we are feeling it, we are seeing it through the weather changes, erratic rainfall, long drought periods. And so we need to change how we do agriculture by now going sustainably. So sustainable agriculture practices, like Christophe mentioned, regenerative agriculture. And one aspect I'll also add to it is sustainable pests and disease management. Mm-hmm. Previously, some insect pests, which were not problems in particular regions, are now thriving in those regions because average temperatures are rising, average rainfall is declining, making the environment conducive for these insect pests to thrive. So if we're talking about yields, we have to deal with insect pest problems, and we have to do sustainably so that we can reduce greenhouse gas emissions and still have our crops for to ensure food security.
Thank you. And so it's interesting how you, rightly so, link challenges with potential solutions. We come back to this in the next round of questions. And of course, what you describe is already a problem today. The framing of my question was a challenge towards 2050. We have a great deal of challenges today. Hopefully, we can look at it as an opportunity to take the time between now and then to really really address them. Patricia, from your perspective, challenges.
So from my perspective, I agree with my panelists that we are going to need some technical innovations to move forward. So, I mean, our capability today isn't meeting the need, and so, projecting forward, we need to. The role of government, let me be very specific, the role of government is not just to foster, and fund research to do that sort of thing, but to create the policies that will allow for an open, transparent, collaborative science and technology ecosystem, so that we can share ideas, we can build capacity around the world, and we can, find solutions together to these problems. And that also includes thinking about policies to break down regulatory barriers that prevent the adoption of new technologies.
There is a great deal to like in your answer. These words like collaboration, together, for creating the right regulatory environment. I think there's really, really key points that hopefully we'll have time to come back to. Jack, from your perspective.
Yeah, the challenges we face, they're big, they're complex, and they're global. Some of them have already been focused on, but 40% of all the land on Earth that could be used for agriculture is already being used for agriculture today. The amount of cropland is the size of South America. The amount of pasture land is the size of Africa. So in terms of land, we're using as much, if not more, than we want. 70% of all fresh water goes to agriculture, and as you mentioned, 10 to 15% of greenhouse gases come from agriculture, another 10 to 15% from deforestation, 80% of which is caused by agriculture. So we definitely need new innovations. But I like to say that I'm a science optimist, but I'm a regulatory pessimist. I'm confident that we have the brain power to solve a lot of these problems, but the question is, will we be allowed to use them? And so, I like to say that people love innovation almost as much as they despise change. And there is no place people despise change more than in the food they eat. Because food is what brings us together with friends, with family, and if you mess with my food, you're messing with my family, and people don't like that. But if we don't change how we produce food, everything will change.
That's really interesting, and I'm so glad you're sitting next to Patricia, because you talked about the challenges in changing in regulation. Of course, you mentioned regulation also. Christoph, you're absolutely right that, of course, it's a matter of family, it's a matter of culture. Food is so deeply ingrained. I now almost wish we had a behavioral scientist at the table as well to tell us how to solve that problem. Really important contributions, and actually highlighting how diverse and how complex these challenges are. And we really need to not just solve one of them, because otherwise the solution will not be appropriate and implementable. Let me turn to you, Karin, and to you, Akua. I'd like to explore a little bit more some of the innovations that were mentioned already, and now I want to talk about sort of technical innovations, or innovations in practice, actual agricultural practice. Which do you see as holding the greatest promise towards enhancing food security? And one thing, if I may add, so far we've talked very almost monolithically about food security, but of course it's just not just a matter of people having enough to eat, it's a matter of them having enough nutrition in the food they eat. So over to you. Maybe I'll start with you. If you think of what do you see as the most promising innovative technologies?
I see precision agriculture as really innovative for our time, because conventionally we do blanket application or blanket management of agricultural inputs. If there is the need to apply fertilizer, we do it blanketly. If there's a need to apply insecticides, we do it blanketly for the whole plot of land. But there is a need to identify which plants or which areas really need them. That's a precision agriculture. And so we indulge the use of sensors and drones to identify particular areas where there are hotspots of insects or where there is a nutrient need. There are sensors that detect the soil moisture in the soil, and so you are able to target irrigation to those areas instead of just irrigating the whole land, and some portions might not need it. So we need to save on that cost by doing it precisely, thereby reducing the greenhouse gas effects that might come out with regards to putting in agricultural inputs. And then the drones will also help give signals on pest infestation and diseases. So we do targeted application, because obviously fertilizer increases the greenhouse gas effects, and we need to do it correctly. Similarly, all the agriculture inputs we need to put in place, we need to do them correctly and targeted, so that we can minimize the cost involved and also the possible emissions that will result in our actions.
Very interesting. And precision agriculture is, of course, a relatively recent term. It's in its very nature incredibly multidisciplinary, and that, of course, requires collaborations. I think we will talk about that in a few minutes. Karin, from your perspective, what's most promising in terms of innovation?
You named an important one, Akua. I would say the enlargement of the toolkit is the most promising in my view. So it's not one or the other. So we need to become better at the quality of seeds, let's say heat resistance or stress resistance, in disease resistance, insect resistance. So the quality of the seeds as such, then modern crop protection product, whether it's synthetic crop protection or so insecticides, herbicides, fungicides, or biological and biostimulants, and also, let's say, the technology where it comes from shouldn't matter, right? The technology as such, whether it's GMO, whether it's gene edited, whether it's conventional, it should not play such a big role as it does today in the minds of people, because I think what needs to count is the result that we achieve with the technology. And precision agriculture combined with this, plus irrigation and crop rotations, so good practices in the field, also those that we used in the past or that come from organic agriculture that we can learn from, combined in this toolkit. I think all this together is the promising piece in my view.
That's great. So really what's emerging from your answers is that precision, the targeting, but also the diversity of tools. So as you say, diversifying the toolkit. Christoph, what do you see as, from this sort of startup ecosystem that could lead to breakthroughs in food technology, and how can these solutions can be scaled safely and effectively?
So, food is, you name some numbers, food is actually the second largest industry in the world after real estate. So the stakes are very high. And the issues that need to be tackled, both to increase production, but also to lessen the impact on climate, are very diverse. We're big believers in synthetic biology and the use of fermentation in creating new food. So we have companies that, we have one company, for instance, that turns a brewery into a protein factory, using actually the food waste from the brewery. And with one brewery, you can feed the whole protein need of 20 million people. And it's actually also very tasty. So this is a kind of breakthrough technology that we feel are actually very scalable. It also happens to be very inexpensive, so it will be relevant globally. And we see that on multiple levels, whether it's animal feed or feeding people. It's really that plus what you've mentioned, the leveraging AI and robotics in agriculture is a big area. I guess the third one is more in your camp, which is resilient crop, whether it's through microbial solution or through changed organism, is something we'll have to deal with. Right now there's a bit of a blindfold here. No, we don't want to touch it, but there's just no way out. We'll need all of the above in order to have an impact.
Mm-hmm. So let me just ask a follow-up question, which will lead me into a question that I have for Patricia next. So my question was more about the startup environment and the scaling up, which of course you addressed. But can you give us a little bit more of an insight into that transition from the contributions that come from the startup sector and how that scaled up? Because of course agriculture, as you say, it's a great business, it's a great industry. There are some very large players. What's that collaboration, the intersection between the startups and the larger players?
Well, actually, we work very closely with the industry. A lot of our investors, very large industry players, the companies that we have, they sometimes raise money from industry players. So I would say right now the issue is less on the consumer side, because obviously the product have to be tasty. They have to. That's like a prerequisite. Those you don't have but more on the regulatory side. We have, unfortunately, a number of companies now that are considering moving outside of Europe, simply because of the pace and in transparency of all the process involved in bringing this product to market. That's, for me, an unnecessary wall that we need to bring down. The innovation ecosystem per se is actually very vibrant. You have a multidisciplinary component, technology coming from biology, technology coming from computational science, all being applied now to solving this fundamental problem.
Mm-hmm. So that's a very positive picture. So let's talk about collaborations. You talked about collaborations in your first response, and of course collaboration can happen at needs to happen at many different levels. We're talking about research institutes. We're talking about the private sector. We talk about regulators. So talk to us. Are you optimistic about that partnership between governments, academia, and private sector to drive this progress towards sustainable food production? And remember, you have a skeptic right next to you.
Well, then I have to be the optimist,
Yeah.
right?
Yes,
I have
please.
the pessimist here.
Please.
Let me actually start kind of from the top down and talk about a couple of programs that we support from the U.S. State Department. So we've invested $1 billion a year in our flagship food security initiative, which is called Feed the Future, and it involves 20 countries. It was launched in 2013, involves 20 countries, and over the years it's lifted 23.4 million people above the poverty line and helped 3.4 million children avoid stunting due to malnutrition. But the program isn't just about providing food. It's really about providing training to farmers in agricultural science, building agricultural ecosystems so that local communities can feed themselves. And it's helped more than 6.2 million producers apply improved agricultural practices. So again, this is kind of a very top-down, sort of system-level way of trying to address the issue. We have created, Secretary Blinken actually created a global food security office within the State Department, and Dr. Kerry Fowler, who runs that office, and you mentioned nutrition, he is all about nutrition. Even if you talk to him about aquaculture, to him it's all about the quality of the food that you are feeding the aquatic life. So he created, building on the Feed the Future program in 2023, that office launched the Vision for Adaptive Crops and Soils. And we've committed about $150 million towards that program, again, with multiple countries and in partnership with the UN and the African Union. And it's really to look at building healthy, fertile soils to improve the nutrition, but also trying to introduce often indigenous crops that are bred to be more climate resistant, so more heat and pestilence resistant. And so that's kind of a top-down thing that we work with the UN on that. So I think this is always the challenge, right? How do you connect in the science diplomacy world and the development world? How do you connect those top-down initiatives with the bottom-up researcher? The bottom-up, as I said, the government has a role to foster the bottom-up research. We foster people exchanges, like the Fulbright Specialist Program, is, of course, is sort of the flagship program in that. And so how do you make that connection between the two? I think that the really important key there is collaboration, not just government to government, but we really have to engage the private sector. If we're going to move those innovations, and we saw some wonderful examples yesterday in the flash talks of innovation that can really improve yields and climate resistance, we have to engage the private sector to move those technologies forward into production. We also have to engage communities. We have to engage the public, because ultimately they're the ones who have to adopt the technology, and they have to be comfortable with that.
That is absolutely right. And this is a perfect lead up to a question I have for Jack. But before I go there, you just mentioned indigenous crops, and you mentioned that sort of in one sentence where you said, really enhancing and modifying these indigenous crops to leverage both their adaptation to where we want to leverage them, and then bringing together the tools, the modern tools that we have today. Would anyone like to speak? Maybe, Karin, I'm sort of looking at you. Do you feel that CropSciences or other big players in that space are realizing that potential of indigenous crops today, or is it something that you're looking towards with potential enhancement?
I did not come across that kind of, discussion at Bayer yet. It doesn't mean that at scientist level, the knowledge in the seeds breeding technology is not taken care of. But as I'm a little bit further away from the breeding technology, I personally did not hear about it. If it was a big thing, I would have heard about it. So it's probably still at the beginning of awareness. Yeah?
Exactly, and I guess it's perhaps a more localized solution by definition. I mean, the example that comes to my mind when we talk about indigenous crops is something like teff, a type of wheat that grows in the mountainous areas of Ethiopia, particularly adapted to grow there. But perhaps, as you say, because it's localized, there is less specific focus on it. But I think it's important. It may actually come hand in hand with what you talked about earlier, Jack, and that's that acceptability of food. If it's something that already fits in the local culture, but is then further supported, if you like, supplemented with contemporary technologies, then that may be easier to implement. So let me stay with you. I want to talk about stakeholder engagement. You talked about farmers. We already talked about governments. We talked about private sector. But what about the society? I know you care deeply about the very prominent polarization in the society, which can undermine solutions. How can we overcome that?
Yeah, science tells us what we can do, but it's the public that tells us what we should do. And so if they don't trust in the scientists to bring those technologies to market, it doesn't matter if we have solutions if we don't get to use them. And so I think there needs to be a more open conversation around science and technology and what future do we all want. When Bill Gates says that we'll all be eating synthetic meat in 2030, he makes that future less likely because it's not a future that sounds exciting to many people. And so, on the other hand, I think we all want safe, nutritious food. And so how we communicate really matters. And, all of these things are intertwined. In the small indigenous crops, that relates to the work of Dr. Kerry Fowler because he helped to set up the Svalbard Seed Center along with Jeffrey Houghton, saving hundreds of thousands of seed varieties. But many of them are not as high yielding. So they're resilient, they're adapted to a particular climate, but they're a tenth of the yield of traditional wheat. And so how do we leverage the innovation of modern technology to help those varieties improve faster? But if the consumer doesn't want it, it's not going to happen. And so I think, transparency, engagement, stakeholder dialogues, all of those things are critically important at the beginning of the process so that we can all agree on the future that we want. And, I often say that my personal mission is to de-escalate this tension in our food system so we can all get about our business of saving the planet in our own way. And I think more solutions are needed and more people need to be engaged.
I think it's so important. You talked about stakeholder dialogues, and I was reminded of the dialogues that ran in parallel with the UN Food System Summit around food system transformation, and they were really local dialogues happening right across the globe. My understanding is they were very successful. There was great engagement in them, right?
Yeah, I participated in some related to livestock production and alternative proteins. And so, they were also all over the map, both geographically, but in terms of different technologies as well.
Mm. And you mentioned GMO a couple of times. Here we are sitting in Europe. When I talk about genetic modification, and of course today is a very different, technically very different conversation from what it was when we first talked about it. But when we talk about it, let's say in the US, it's a very different proposition. People believe it's completely acceptable. Here, it's very different. From your perspective, are we communicating better now? Are we moving towards a greater acceptance, especially given that the technology is so much more precise? And let's face it, with precision genomic engineering, often you cannot actually recognize that the product has been modified today.
So I think we made some great mistakes in the past in Europe about GMO and how we talked about GMO and underestimating that every word counted and every word was so important and was misleading people into what we are facing today. I think we do much better with the other technology because gene editing is different. So there's, as you rightly pointed out, gene editing. I think we are more conscious, we are more educated in how we talk about it and responsible about how we talk about it, and also aware that every word counts here because people get scared off for false reasons otherwise. So I think that is, we're better now and we've made the difference. But I also think it's such an unfortunate thing that we missed the train on GMO. And I'm not very hopeful it'll come back here, and it's not going to be straightforward. I think that's water under the bridge, I believe, for Europe. I'm not very hopeful. I'm more pessimistic.
I would say, but it's for all technology. I was working with a professor at the university who's working on regenerative soils, and he went to a conference on regenerative agriculture, and he said his presentation was not well received. And he was shocked. And I said, well, how did you talk about it? And he said, well, I was talking about moving from intensive farming systems to regenerative farming systems. And I said, so you were telling them to stop being bad farmers and you were going to come and tell them how to be a good farmer. Mm-hmm. And you can imagine people crossing their arms, leaning back and just shutting down. Mm-hmm. And if instead he had said, farming in the UK is becoming more regenerative, here are some ways of accelerating the process. They lean forward, they're like, tell me more. Mm-hmm. And so it's not just genetic technologies, but it's a lot of different technologies. We can either shut people down or we can get them excited about the opportunity. Mm.
That's such an important, I'll bring you in one second, that's such an important point, which I think is translatable to all aspects of communication. If you tell people they're bad, they disengage, as opposed to if you tell them that there is an opportunity for them to make a greater contribution, that's immediately engagement. Christoph?
Well, I'm a bit more optimistic, especially when it comes to consumer adoption. We didn't have kiwis when I was born, and it's fine today. So we just have to have the proper product outcome. We have a company actually based in Berlin that's doing lab-grown cheese. As we know, 15% of the greenhouse emission are actually dairy, and that product is fantastic. And it's on the shelf, and it's physically and in terms of health as good or better than the dairy version, and that is working. So, GMO is a particular problem. It's where we face ideology, frankly, and where people are closing down to science. And we have, unfortunately, here sometimes politics stands in the way of science, and we have some experiences in Europe where it's not fully understandable where they stand. You could argue that there are some lobbies behind it, but it's probably more simple than that. It's just not equipped or motivated actually to foster breakthrough technology that bring 10x less or 100x less emission, 10x better yield, lower price, scalability. That should be embraced.
Absolutely, and you just said politics stands in the way of science. I think we had a number of examples where we could also say that science stands in the way of science and how we communicate it as well. So there are many different aspects here that have to be considered. I'm going to open up to the audience, but I just want to ask, a term regenerative agriculture was used a few times, but we never actually explained what that is. Would someone like to briefly explain? Go ahead.
Well, it's all about introducing new methodology in farming. So it's actually more of a process innovation. We have one company here called Klim focusing on that. The result after 2 or 3 years are actually better yields and more money for the farmer. It takes this transition period, and so the farmer has to believe in it. But regenerative farming has to be part of the solution. One of the biggest issue we're facing is soil depletion. And especially in the US, and regenerative farming, it's meaning being better for the soil, caring for the microbiome ecosystem in the soil, is the only way forward.
And now I would like to add to that. So with regenerative agriculture, it's a combination of sustainable practices. For instance, the inclusion of cover cropping in your farming system, the crop rotation, and we can talk of companion cropping, where some crops have benefits, mutual benefits. For instance, we talk about the 3 sisters, the corn, the squash, and then the bean. The corn becomes a stake for the bean, which creeps and introduces nitrogen to the soil, and then the squash covers the soil and protects the soil surface. So regenerative agriculture sustains the soil, prevents it from degradation, erosion, and increases the organism growth in it, the diversity, and also increases the biodiversity in the ecosystem. And also, it also includes the biocontrol mechanisms, where we leverage on the use of pathogens, predators, and microbes to manage pests, and also the use of natural pesticides from plants, extracts, essential oils. So it's a whole package of sustainable practices that intend to produce more but reduce impacts of agriculture on the climate.
Exactly. So you just described very beautifully the ecosystem context in which, of course, agriculture unfolds. Karin, you have something to add?
Yeah, I agree to what I said. In my mind, and I try to make it simple, we come from sustainable agriculture, less inputs, more output, to less input, more output, but also restoring more. And that goes in line with so better soils, healthier soils, less water use, high quality water, more biodiversity, but also more yield due to the you also stressed that. And ideology free. The technology does not matter. The result matters in the end. So that's why I would summarize it.
Thank you. Are there any questions from the audience? Any comments? There's a question over there, or there's a question here and over there. Maybe go ahead, you're close to the microphone, and then we'll come to you.
Yes. Hello, I'm Alexander Balabanov. I'm from the Technion in Israel. And I volunteer in a program that works with food salvaging. 30% of all food production is being wasted, and I can't remember the exact numbers, but if we consider it as financial problem, it's like the 6th biggest economy. It's food that is being thrown away, perfectly good food. Is there any talk about that? How to improve those systems?
Thank you. A terrific addition to our conversation about food waste. Who would like to address? Karin, go first, and then you.
No, well, it's a big theme. It's also a bit complex because it has to do with either a new supply chain solution. We've backed a few companies in that space. One is out of Oxford. They basically have, for organic food waste in restaurant and hotel, like an on-site fermenter that would turn that into biofuel. There are multiple points in the value chain where you have to address in order to reduce food waste, which is crazy. It's 35. Some countries 40% of the food is being wasted.
Yeah, Karin, you want?
Yeah, we've come across that challenge every time that we talk about more yield. Do we really need that? We get the challenge back. No, we don't need more yield, but we need to throw away less food. And that's true. It's just something that it's not one or the other. I believe the problem in the world that we are throwing away so much food or wasting so much food is such a huge topic with so many individuals that you need to, activate to do that I wouldn't bet on this alone to solve the problem. Yes, if we all make an effort there, then the yield pressure gets less, and that would be great. But I would not bet on it to just rely on this to solve itself, because there's too little hope in my view that we will all collectively get this done by the time that we need to get it done.
And I'll need to add that food waste starts from the farm gate. So how do we get the farmers to get their yields or their produce to the farm? Mm-hmm. I think we all need to get engaged. Farmer cooperatives, institutions need to come on board to ensure that the food that the farmers produce don't get wasted at the gates, but gets to the stores. And when they get to the stores, how do we ensure that food that gets to the stores are not wasted? There should be a system to evenly distribute the food that is produced. Because I think food security, we can talk of a scale of 0 to 100, where there are people who have less food, others have abundance, and then all we need is just a middle line. So how do we get to distribute the foods across the various places so that everybody gets food secure? I think organizing institutions and policies need to be put in place. We can leverage on technology to identify sources of where food are produced, and then another technology that would help distribute the foods equally so that at least we can minimize waste. And consumer behavior is also very important. Mm-hmm. Sometimes we buy more than we can consume. The fact that we have the fiscal power does not mean we should buy more. We should just try and change our behavior as individuals to conscientize ourselves to reduce waste as much as we can, by starting from our homes. Let's just produce or buy just what is enough for us, and then the rest we hope that some institutions would distribute the food so that everybody will have some portion of food.
That's a really important point. I think we tend to think about consumers when we think about food waste, but you added a really important point that, of course, food waste can happen at any point in the chain, and then so there we just brought into the whole logistics of distribution aspect, which is very important. Jack, you have something else?
I was just going to say, I think in low and middle income countries, most waste occurs before the consumer. In high income countries, it happens after the consumer. And food waste is not one problem, it's 1,000 problems. The 3 most wasted food items in many countries is bread, potatoes, and apples. And so those are wasted very differently in our food supply. Some of the people that waste the most food post-consumer are the people who are struggling the most. Mm-hmm. And so if it was easy to get rid of, it wouldn't exist. And some of the reason it exists is because people don't have freezers, they have to travel for a half an hour to get to a retail store, so they only do it once every 2 weeks, and then they buy too much because they know they're not going to get there again. So it's often a poverty problem as well. And so it needs to be done, some of the work in France, things happening in China. So there are policies that can help to drive better outcomes, changing best buy and use by labels that are less confusing to consumers when it's a quality issue versus a food safety. So we absolutely need to tackle it, but it's not a single problem.
Exactly. We have one quick question there and another one there, and then I'm afraid it's going to be time.
Thank you so much thank you so much for this insight. I'm a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Twente in the Netherlands, and I work with sustainable polymer chemistry. So my question is, how can chemistry and material science help or contribute to address this problem?
Thank you. Would one panelist, Jack,
Nope.
you were first.
Nope.
Okay,
Yes,
go on.
chemistry is very relevant in biology because if we understand the chemical dimensions of biology, we're able to solve problems better. For instance, I'm a chemical ecologist. I tend to understand the chemistry between plants and insects, what makes an insect attracted to a plant and not the other. So understanding the chemistry is important. We can leverage on that to develop attractants or lures so we can use in pest management and then reduce dependency on insecticides use. And then again, there are polymers that can degrade toxins in the soil. Mm-hmm. So chemistry comes in handy to degrade or detoxify toxins that are already in the soil so that we can have a safe environment.
Thank you.
And then there are edible polymers that allow to reduce food waste as well. So,
right.
Yeah.
Last question. I think if you just speak, it'll...
Yeah. So my name is Agata Stasic. I'm a social researcher of sustainable transition processes. And I just wanted to focus even more the meaning of like early engagement and with farmers. And what is especially important, in my opinion, is that we speak a lot about how the food is connected to identity, to culture, to behaviors, maybe there are also some prejudices against science, but actually what matters a lot are interests. And there are some obvious conflict interests between new companies in the agricultural sector, both established companies and startups, and traditional farming. So the question is how to make sure that these new solutions will bring co-benefits to existing farmers to stop backlash, which pose very high risk for this whole transition process. Thanks.
Thank you. A very interesting question, a very complex question. We only have about 10 seconds for the answer. Karin.
Okay, I'll be quick. So, yes, and I would start with the farmers. I think farmers generally, I speak about Germany just to make it, because I know them best right now in the last years. Many farmers are very open to try new things. It helps if government incentivizes the use of these new technologies at the beginning and then shows them, okay, it's worth it, and then they usually take it up quicker. Startups partner a lot with industry to scale things because it's a lot of capital investment you need to put in. And I have a great hope, let's say, speaking for us, for biologics and organic, products, there we don't do own research. We rely on startups to bring these products, then we bring them to scale. But we also, in the precision agriculture space, see, the farmers want to adopt it, but they need incentivization at the beginning, and then it can be scaled.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So this is a Falling Walls conference. So I'm going to wrap up by asking you to respond to this challenge, but you only have one word to respond with.
Okay.
And that is, what is the most, from your perspective, what's the most important wall that needs to fall down if we're going to have sustainable food systems in 2050? You can go first.
Ideology.
Okay.
Regulations.
Regulation, yeah.
Research.
Research.
Communication.
Oh, communication is what I was going to say.
Somebody has
It
to
has
say
to be said
collaboration.
twice because it's collaboration.
Thank you. Thank you very much to my
It's a real
panelists and to all of you. This is a hugely important topic, of course, and it may sound like 2050 is a long time away, but there's no time like the present. Thank you so much.
Yeah.